Hey guys, I'm Yegi Shatini, and today we're going to look at the background music system I made for the game Caesura. Now, the last video I did showed this implementation inside of Wise, and today we're doing the Unreal Engine Metasound conversion of that same system. So, like I mentioned last video, there are a ton of ways to implement these things, and the more complex you get, the more ways there is to do it. So, as far as this video is concerned, I may breeze over a couple things. You might want to look back at the Wise video I did, but all of the audio I'm using is taken directly from I did from Wise. In a few occasions, I'll kind of specifically mention how I would do things differently had I built it for Unreal Engine specifically. Now, general overview, this is kind of trying to emulate the Breath of the Wild Hyrule Field Day music. That's like the primary inspiration, and that's what I consider this explorer music. And then we want to be able to dynamically switch into combat as enemies approach or if we walk into a combat arena. And like with Wise, I wanted this all contained within one event, and in our case here, it's all going to be inside of one Metasound. So we have our master Metasound here that holds everything. We have 3 separate levels. Each of the levels is going to switch into a combat track that's shared between the 3, and then each level has a shared Breath of the Wild melody. Anytime you see Kondo, that's what it's referring to, as well as pads, and then each level has a specific level melody and level rhythm. So let's hop in Engine and give it a listen first. So the first thing here is just going to be the pads and the Kondo Explore melodies in the background. This is just kind of how I tested because this is shared between every level. Right, if I come here, we're at Fungi Stage 1. And then these numbers down here are dynamically increasing intensity as the stages go by. So a little more percussive. A little more instrumentation still. Then say I go into combat, it's gonna switch into that. Boom, doing combat things. As that ends, I go back into my level, and it goes from there. So everything's switching dynamically and can be placed how we need it. So first thing, let's look at the level blueprint. There's a lot going on here, but we'll go piece by piece. So first thing up top, I just have my quartz clock that I'm creating. This is just the standard method of implementing it. There are tons of tutorials on this, but if you want me to walk through it, then let me know down below. So I just start my clock, play my master Metasound, and then one thing I'm doing in here is I'm calling the event on each bar to cue my like explore melodies, and then this will look inside of the Metasound to play that, but that is subscribed to the bar. All right, and then a lot of this is really just kind of overlap events when I hit the objects to play the music. So a lot of these things would be inside of, say, your specific level blueprints, or maybe some something you have playing in your level, like when you cue the start of a level. But then as far as like starting combat and explore, like maybe as you approach an enemy and things like that. But I'll talk about the relevant things as we get there. So let's go into the Metasound, because that's the fun stuff besides the quartz clock. All right, so everything here is going into this mixer, and we'll break down this left part first, because this is the fancy things. This is all of my explore things. So let's start up top. When it comes to these systems, it's really just kind of building one layer at a time. So I started with the pads, that's always playing no matter what level. I made its own patch just to keep things a little cleaner. Now inside of this patch, all that's happening is I have this trigger repeat that's going on the length of each pad, kind of. It has its own, like, I think they're each 8 measures or something, so I have the period out here. And then that repeats just going into a 50-50, and it's picking a random one of 6 different tracks, right? So these are all, I think the wave assets are out here. These are all just sustains with the synth. A little panning left and right. So I just imported all of those and had those go in. And it's either playing them just as I had the audio, or the other half of the time I just added a little more effect towards the end, some flanger and reverb, just so it sounded a little different and it wasn't quite the same thing repeating over and over. So this is just very simple. Here's just a random int to grab one of the 6 assets. Alright, so that was the simple part, right? So this is just always playing underneath. If we look down, the condo melody, right, this is referring to the Breath of the Wild kind of situation. So this input, right, this input for the pads, that's just on play. Once the Metasound starts, that's going to play. For the condo melodies, we have a specific input, right, this Q condo, that's what it's getting from the bar quantization effect event that I made. So subscribed on bar in the level blueprint. So here I have it going in a trigger sequence first. I found even when lowering the probability, like even if it's at 10%, there is a chance that it'll play back to back and overlap. So this sequence 2 just kind of gives me a buffer where even if it does trigger and play twice, that at least I know it'll go to an empty sequence and it won't overlap itself. For this patch, again, just trying to keep things cleaner and not all inside of the master Metasound. Here we have a 75% chance that it'll play one of the 3 melodies just randomly, either my guitar harmonics, a harp low or harp high, and then the other 25% of the time it's going to play a harp high, and that's just to give it a little more weighting towards playing those harp high melodies. And really that's it, right? So those are all going into a mixer and then another mixer to combine the bottom portion here. So a lot of these patches are just so I can kind of isolate the probability of each event. You know, they're not really doing anything special, but it does help keep the master blueprint a lot leaner and look a lot cleaner from there. So I get my cue. Half the time, like every other time actually, it's just going to play 40% from here. Is then if it passes that 40% check, it'll play something from in here based on those probabilities. So all those numbers is you just kind of have to get a feel for it, how often you want it to play, and so on. And then those just go into the mixer. I'll come back and talk about condo volume because that involves the later portion. So let's look at the next bit, which is when it starts getting a little more complicated, is our level rhythms. So start of level, I'm just starting it muted. Again, that's just for the sake when I hit play, I want to make sure that these things were working. So this wouldn't be here, right? We would be loading into a level, so I wouldn't have to start it muted. So let's take a look at this patch first, and we'll talk about the things coming from it. This one looks a bit more complicated, but again, the reason I use patches for this is just to keep all the messy spaghetti, you know, in its own isolated patch. So we're starting with our trigger. It gets repeated. In our case here, it's, I think, every 16 measures. So let's close this. Let's go back here. Every B multiplied by 64. Yes, so it's every 32 measures, I think. BPM to second math is always funky, but that's why we do a lot of testing with it. I'm getting my period. I'm getting the start, right? This is another one that's just starting on play. In our case, when I started on play, it's muted, but once I overlap this box here, that's when it actually volume goes up. So I get that play, and then it gets a level index, which we'll look at from the level blueprint. And that's going to tell me out 0 is my fungi level, out 1 is my second level, right? That would be the mountain or the village, and then out 3 would be my final uh, treetop one. So if we just look at out 0, right, for my first level, because they're all the same, the first one here, we have that first stage of music, the more simple one, and then intensity increase 2, intensity increase to stage 3, and then intensity increase to stage 4. So say you have a certain amount of objectives in the level, each time you finish one, it will tick up to the next iteration. And then the same thing with this middle section for mountain, first intensity, second, third, and fourth, and then first, second, third, and fourth for the village. Now, the first of all of these, right? So fungi 1, mountain 1, village 1 is all going into this first mono mixer here. The second stages are then all going into the second mixer. The third stages is all going together. So I'm grouping each level stage together. From these mixers, then I'm all combining those into my main, what we could call the master mono mix, and then that's going out. So each of these gain inputs is what's controlling, regardless of what level you're on. Gain 0 is controlling that first stage, like when you load in the level volume. Gain 1, that's controlling that second index, third index, and fourth index, and so on. So as I change these knobs, no matter what level you're in, I'm controlling the first, second, or third, or fourth stage inside of the level. Again, that's kind of talking about the level progression itself. All right, so that's what we're getting at with this patch. We just started the on play, so it started. The period is just, again, I think every 32 bars for how I had the music set. And then the level index is getting imported from the level blueprint, which, if we look down here, where's my level index? Set level index back here, right? I just have the widget is on, and then when I, in this case, again, I'm binding it to the UI click, but it would be like on level load or wherever you're loading kind of your levels themselves. So when I click fungi, level index gets set to 0. When I click my second level, my village level, right, the index sets to 1. Mountain sets to 2. So this is just me doing it via widget instead of like on an actual level loading. You could disregard this down here. This was just demonstration purposes, so I can click between the buttons and kind of reset everything. All right, so it sets the level, and that's what reads kind of which grouping of music to play. And now this is what's controlling the actual volume of it. So when I start an overlap or when I start a level, it's the default stage 0, right? We haven't done anything yet. Say I clear the first objective of the map. This gets set to 0. My next stage of the level gets set to 1, right? I clear another objective. This gets set to 0. This gets set to 1. I clear the last objective. This sets to 0. This sets to 1. So in the in the blueprint, the level blueprint, I have this all set here, rhythm intensity change, right? So again, all of mine are bound to on click of a button, but you would bind it to say whatever totem you're cleansing or enemies killed or something like that. When I click that first rhythm button, right, it's muting stage 1, muting stage 0, right? Talking in indexes gets a little confusing, so hopefully you're keeping up with me on that. So stage 0 gets set to 0, stage 1 gets set to 1, right? Turned on. When I clear the second objective, right, it does the next thing. So we can't bounce between, like if I'm in stage 3, I can't go back to stage 1, so I'm not adding a catch-all for that. The only thing I added in addition was the reset for the tutorial. So if I did click stage 1, it resets everything else back to 0, kind of puts it back on default. Again, this is just for testing purposes. Once you make sure everything's right, you would delete stuff like this because you don't need it anymore. All right, so let's kind of go back and look at that so we can recap. So I overlap, my level started. I'm in stage 1 by default. Let's say I cleared my objective. Stage 2, now we hear more percussive going on. Right, everything's increasing. And it would repeat for stage 3 and stage 4. Obviously, your game might not need 4 separate stages, but mine did, so that's how I used them. All right. The final thing, which looks more complicated, but that's just because there's no patch for this one. This is the level melody switching. Very similar to how the level rhythms work, but this is for the melody itself to give each level its own unique theme. So subscribe to the bar. Again, the level melody is getting cued on every bar. Let's see, where's that? Here we go. So I have my quantization event, right? It's still going off the master clock, and I'm just subscribing to it down here. I had one subscription up here, right? Like you could subscribe things wherever you want, so long as your clock variable is there. So here I have my melody switching categorized on its own. The bar is the greatest value you could quantize from, and you can add a counter here, like track the number of bars and say every 8 bars, that's when you want to execute the trigger. But the way I'm doing it is I just chose to execute this every bar, so I can do all the math and probability checks inside of the Metasound. I just find that a lot easier for me. So every time I get that cue, every bar, I'm triggering a filter. And this is only going to trigger 50% of the time. So I don't want this to cue very frequently, which is why I'm doing things the way I did it. Now, input is the same level index. So again, 0, 1, 2, that's just telling me, am I in fungi? Am I in mountain? Am I in village? They're all the same otherwise. All right. So a couple notes I made here. Turn mute, unmute into 1. This is something you can't actually do. Like an output watcher, you can only have one output watcher. So you'll notice here I have mute and unmute, mute, unmute 1, mute, unmute 2. So that's why they're separated that way. And then fixing trigger sequence, that's just going to be how frequently you want it to play. So 50% of the time, it's going to cue the select, cue a sequence, and it's set to play on the first one. Then when I get it again, it's set to silence, 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 silent. So 8 might be a lot. Again, I'd kind of go down. I chose 8 because the length of the melody, this kind of gave me the most sense of doing it. But again, this is just kind of messing around with how frequently you want it to play. Now, inside of it, once it actually plays, it's getting a random melody, right? Any of these, in this case, like these bass lines. It's a little quiet. I don't know if you could hear it. So these are the mountain themes, just different octaves and different variations. So it's going to pick one of those 4, and then it's going to play it. And then once it plays, so this is kind of the important thing with this section. Once it plays, it's watching for that output, and it's going to mute the condo melody, right? Mute my explorers. Once it's finished, it unmutes it. So if we look back to what we skipped earlier, this condo volume, right? These little melodies, which, reminder, right? Those little kind of ambient harp guitar things playing in the background. Once my level melody is playing, this gets set to 0. So even if it's cued and triggered, you're not going to hear it. Once this is done, it hears the unmute condo, which sets it back to 1. Right? And that's literally all that's controlling this input. So when this is actually starting and it fires to play, that's when, if we look back on the level blueprint, we have our Metasound output subsystem, And from this, when you drag off of this is what you get the watch output for, right? So I needed three separate ones because, again, remember, you can only have one output. Like, these can't all share one output, right? It'll overwrite the other one. So I wish I could do that, but yeah. So I have each one. Once we get the mute call, it fires that event, custom event, to set the condo volume to 0, and then in reverse, when it gets the unmute output, we get set condo volume to 1, and it starts playing again, and it'll fade itself in. So that's it with this section, right? So this one's, again, just playing the level melodies as they come up. All three of these are the exact same. The only difference is they have their own output watching, because they have to be specifically on the play and on the finish of the wave asset. All right, so that's it with the explore stuff. All of this, right, this explore sub or stereo mixer is going into kind of what I'm using as the master bus inside of this Metasound. So I just have all of the explore things going into the stereo mixer that I could control, and I just set an input variable called the explore bus. In my case, when I overlap my explore blueprint, right, which is just this little square thing with the trigger volume, once I overlap that, I set my volume up. Well, this was actually just sending the rhythm volume, so let me correct myself. I'm doing this all with the combat because by default it's on explore. So when I hit the second one, which looks identical, but my combat switch, that is when I overlap that, I set my combat to 1 and my explore bus to 0. And then when I leave my combat overlap, I set my combat to 0 and my explore to 1. So this kind of just does that flip-flop between those two buses, where again in the Metasound, if I'm not in combat, this is just set to 1 by default. If I go into combat, this gets to 0, this gets to 1. And we could hear that in the Metasound too. Now remember, a lot of the level melody and condo things are based on graph inputs, so you're not going to hear them here. So you hear the pads. And then we start combat. Leave combat. That's just kind of what happens in the level blueprint. Alright, so that was all the explore stuff. So that was really the complicated one, and that's what I just started with. Again, like I said, with Metasounds, it's all about building layer by layer as you add it in, and then check once you test it and it works, you add in the next layer. So I had all of that ready. I had it all in the mixer, and then I made this master bus because I knew I needed to do the combat switch. So let's look at that real quick. Let's look into this patch, which again, this is one of the cases where it's like if I made it directly for Unreal, I would have done it differently because I had to do some funky math things because some of these phrases were half a phrase, and I had to do some fixes on that. This is another input that starts just on play, right? If I turn both of these on, both things are playing. So that's why by default I start combat off. This way I could fade in and out without any weird clipping and so on. So if we look at this patch, this is my combat patch. It's getting my trigger, right? And I'm just repeating this on the period. Let's look at these middle couple because I didn't have to do anything weird here. I think these are every 16 bars. It just plays. I have my bass array with like 2 or 3 variations of bass, 2 or 3 horn variations, 2 or 3 kit variations. For this up here, the ostinato pattern, these were only half the length, so they were like 8 bars. So I had to make sure to kind of add an extra repetition to make sure I actually heard this playing and it looped itself enough times. So that's like triggering twice within every time these are getting triggered. And then down here, starting on the beginning of a phrase or halfway through. So these are like my little melodies playing on top. I didn't want this to play every time. So when I get my trigger repeat, I'm either 50-50 going to play it and it starts at the beginning of the phrase, or I add a delay to it, which that delay is again half of the phrase. So this is like 8 measures instead of 16, and then it's going to play halfway through the phrase. Right, again, if you remember the way I did it in Wise, I always like having some of them start at the beginning of the phrase, some of them start halfway through the phrase. So that's what's controlling all of this. Again, going into a mixer, and then boom, the outputs for the patch. So very lean compared to all the other stuff for combat, but I get my input, it's playing, and again, here I just have these are my variations for the ostinatos, some of my melodies, and my different things. So I just plug those all into the combat patch. And then, yeah, every 16 bars, 12 bars, 32 bars, I don't know. Yeah, so that's it when it comes to the combat switch, right? So at that point, it was just a matter of plugging it in and making sure it actually flipped. So my level blueprint, the only thing that I have to do to control the sound itself for combat is when I overlap with the combat area, or say proximity based on an enemy, I would set the combat bus to 1, mute the explore bus. Now, don't get this confused because Unreal Engine does have actual audio buses. I just wanted to keep it contained in my Metasound so I could enter combat, leave combat as much as I wanted. Right, so if I just have my, let's do a different one. Let's do Village Stage 3. So I'm going around, let's say I go near enemies. I'm not ready for combat, I could run away or something. And the enemies are over there. And it keeps going back and keeps playing behind it, right? Right now my explore music is still playing. Right, and that would just keep going. So hopefully that all made sense. If you have questions on anything I did or reasons as to why I approach it as such, then of course ask me down below. But this is like my way of how I would convert the Wise system I did to Unreal Engine. So let me know if you have any questions down below, and then stay tuned for more future uploads. Thanks.